Okay, on the theme of GST, let's talk about G is for GST.
GST, Goods and Services Tax.
And I know a lot of people think, oh my God, good GST, but we do get so many questions about it. It's been around now for 23 years, and yet it still seems to cause a lot of confusions, and people still have some ideas that are not correct about how GST works. So we thought we'd just go through and give you some ideas of what we think, explain GST in a very simple way, and what you need to know if you're in business and you are registered for GST, or perhaps if you're in business and you're not registered for GST, because some people are still doing that wrong too.
Exactly right.
So I might just go back and give you a little history lesson. I think I'm the better one to give the history lesson because I was around when GST came in. Jade, you were alive, but I believe you were in kindergarten.
Yes, so GST was not on my radar. I was still learning to colour in.
Okay, so I was working. The I do remember it. First of all, just going back a little bit, back in high school when I was in year 12, that was in the 80s, and there was the talk of bringing in a broad-based consumption tax then, and that was through the Keating the Keating government. Might have been the Hawke and Keating government, I think. So that was the first time I'd ever heard of it. I'd never heard of GST or consumption tax. It wasn't called GST then. There have been a couple of moves to bring that in, and then eventually it did get passed in 1999 under a legislation called a New Tax System, Goods and Services Tax Act of 1999. And it was all over the news. It was incredibly controversial. There was so much. This is the biggest tax reform that I can really remember in my lifetime. Of course, there was the 85 capital gains tax stuff and fringe benefit tax, which was the previous biggest tax reform. I was at high school then. I do remember it, but it didn't really mean anything to me, whereas GST meant a whole lot because I was working at that stage and had to do a lot of stuff to get it through. So the problem that we had when they did bring in this, it was really hard for the Costello. Peter Costello was the treasurer at the time. He was acting really hard, really to try and get this through. It was a really close call that it may never have happened. And we had the Democratic Party who were holding the balance of power, and they didn't want GST on certain products. And as a result, we have a very complicated system. The GST Act doesn't include GST on certain food items and essentials. It also doesn't include it on education, medical, and something else that I can't think of right now.
Education?
Childcare, I think it is. Childcare, yeah. So, we've got this kind of complicated system where most things have GST on them and some don't. And what should be a very simple 10% ended up being quite complicated.
Yeah, exactly right. So it did come into effect on the 1st of July 2000 under the John Howard government, of course.
Yes. So at the time, it also took over from what was called sales tax. So, of course, you would not remember what sales tax is, but we used to have a sales tax regime where all these different products had different levels of sales tax on it. And it was actually quite complicated as well. And don't forget, back then our systems weren't as easy to use as they are today. So you go and buy something, say, from Bunnings, and depending on what aisle you're in, it might have had 10% sales tax, it might have had 20% sales tax, it might have had 30% sales tax. You wouldn't have known because it was all built into the price, but the people who were working in the background had to then go and pay, take that sales tax off. Kind of like if you buy cigarettes today, you're paying a tax on your cigarettes. It's built into the price. You're not paying it separately. Whereas this flipped it around, and the GST was then just added on to the purchase price and added as a flat rate of 10%.
Which, it does make it a little bit easier, but I guess our complication is that not everything has that 10% on it.
So let's go back to basics. If you're in business, and when do you register for GST? So what are the thresholds to register for GST?
So if you are in business, you need to register for GST if your turnover is exceeding $75,000. Now, this is turnover, not profit. So you may only have a profit of $10,000, but your turnover might be over that 75. You still need to register based on your turnover. That's if you're just a normal kind of business. If you're a not-for-profit organisation, the turnover threshold is $150,000, And the only one that is different as well is if you're a taxi or an Uber driver or anything like that, you need to be registered no matter what your turnover is.
Yeah, there are a couple of things that are a little bit exceptional like that. One thing though that a lot of people get confused about is so it's business income, so it's not necessarily all income. So some things are what we call input tax credited, which means that they're things that essentially don't have GST to them. Things like bank fees. I mean, bank fees are kind of still a business I guess for a bank, they were definitely an income item, but there is no GST charge on that. The other thing that doesn't have GST on it is domestic rent. So if you're got an investment property, you are not in business just because you've got an investment property. Even if you are in business and you also have an investment property within that same structure, there is no GST charge on the domestic rent. It is input tax, ITC, input taxed, which means that you can also not claim the GST on any expenses relating to those things. So if you have an investment property and you're paying for repairs and maintenance for that investment property out of your company, which some people do, and it is domestic, you can't claim that GST back. So that's a little bit complicated, but just be careful, I guess, be guided by what your accountant tells you.
Yeah, exactly. And it's probably important to mention that if you are not registered for GST, you cannot charge GST. We do see people do that quite a few times. If they're in business, they're adding GST onto their invoices even though they're not registered. You can't do that.
Yeah, really important. I can't believe we still see that happening, but it definitely happens. You only charge GST if you are registered for GST. So what do we do when we do charge GST? How do we tell the tax office about it?
So we need to lodge a BAS or a business activity statement. These are usually lodged monthly or quarterly. The most common is quarterly. And it essentially is where you tell the ATO your sales for that quarter, the GST on those sales, and then you also tell them the GST on your purchases, and it does a calculation as to whether you need to pay the ATO or the ATO owe you money.
That's correct. Now, a lot of people get really hung up on their BAS and they get concerned that they might have made a mistake, or what if they've missed something. So the tax office give us a threshold of $5,000. So if you have made a mistake in your BAS and it's less than $5,000 GST impact, then you can just correct it in the next business activity statement. If it is more than $5,000, then you should really go back and amend the statement. We have a 4-year period of amendment, so you can only go back 4 years to amend an activity statement. After that, whatever has happened in it is stuck. You can't do that.
Exactly.
You can't change it. Any other things that you want to talk about?
I guess
GST?
maybe we should mention how people can register for GST if they need to. So you probably can... You can do this yourself on the ATO business portal if you have an account. Otherwise, contact your accountant and they can do it for you because it doesn't take too long. It's a 5-minute process to register for GST. And then if you are lodging a BAS, if your accountant's doing it, that's fine. They'll get it sorted for you. If you are lodging it yourself, you can also do that online through the ATO business portal.
Okay. There are a couple of things that can be a little tricky, which I won't go into too much detail of, but you might hear of things called like the margin scheme, which is to do with builders. So if you're a builder and you're building properties, or if you're developing a property, which may actually not, you might not even be a builder, you might just be someone who owns land and is suddenly deciding to subdivide it. There is GST on land, so just be careful with that. If it doesn't have, there's a whole lot of law around property and GST. So if you're in that sort of situation, I really strongly advise that you get some advice on that. If you're selling a business, it may have GST on it unless it's sold as a going concern. Again, there's different things about that. They're very complicated. I'm not going to go into them right now, but if you are in a situation where you have a big transaction coming up that could potentially have GST on it, you really should get some advice from an accountant or a business advisor to know exactly what GST you might be payable.
Exactly
on what you
right.
can do about
So
it.
hopefully that sheds a bit of light on GST.
One last
it.
thing. Divided
Yes.
by 11. So, okay, this is something a lot of people get confused. So when we do GST, it's either GST inclusive or GST exclusive. So let's say we've got something that's $10 that the actual purchase price is $10 and we're going to add GST to it. We would add $1 of GST. It would cost us $11. So the GST exclusive price is $10 and the GST inclusive price is $11. If you have been quoted something with a GST inclusive, the way to work out the GST is to divide it by 11, not divide it by 10. So a lot of people go, $11 divided by 10, that's not going to give me the GST. You have to divide it by 11. It's a maths thing. If you want to do the maths, go work it out. But dividing by 11 is how we work out how much GST is on something that is GST
That's right.
inclusive.
We do see a lot of people get caught out with that and divide it by the 10.
Yes, so just be careful with that as well. All right, I know it's probably a little bit of a boring topic, but I think when people are starting out in business, they don't really understand GST, even though it is just a flat 10%. Probably doesn't sound that complicated, but it kind of is, and that's why we have us
Exactly
accountants to help
right.
you.
And you want to get it right. You want to get your BAS right, and you also kind of want to understand how it works and what the figures in the BAS even mean. So hopefully that helps people a bit.
And it's not your money. You're collecting it for the tax office. So just be careful you don't spend your GST and then have to pay it and go, oh my gosh, I have no money left. The other thing a lot of people say is, but I've paid so much tax this year. You're literally just collecting it for the tax office. You should be charging it on top of what you would have charged if you didn't have to charge GST. It's really just being the tax collector. So try not to
Exactly right. So we do often suggest to people to open a separate bank account and just transfer that 10% of GST straight into there when you get paid.
Okay, well, I think that's enough for today.